Hey everybody. So continuing on, I want to go over today as you're approaching doing your sort of mixing project in using the pre-recorded stems. I wanted to go over a philosophy of mixing. Sort of what is mixing? Why do we do it? What are the things that are important? I find that mixing is one of the topics that can be really challenging to approach without mentorship. You know, if you go onto YouTube and you look up mixing, you'll see lots of people talking about, oh, here's the best vocal chain, or here's this processing technique. It's all tips and tricks, but without a fundamental sort of philosophy of what you're doing and why you're doing it, it can be very hard to incorporate that information into a practice. So I want to kind of break it down, and my true goal is here is to bring it down to essential principles. Like, what are the principles of mixing? What are we doing? What are we not doing? And kind of give you a framework for the choices that you make anytime that you are mixing music. So what is mixing? So in the big picture, mixing is a stage after the recording is done where you blend the individual tracks together. So mixing happens after everything's been recorded, and I would say after things have been edited. You've gone through and you've selected which takes you want. You selected, you've kind of finalized the arrangement of the song. Mixing is really a step after that. You can kind of plan ahead to mixing by using the right microphone, by making sure you're capturing the best versions of your signals. Those are all important things, but mixing is really the stage that happens after. So I want to explore today, as I mentioned in the previous presentation, we're going to use some cooking analogies here when talking about mixing. I find this can be really helpful, and a good way to teach about these type of subjects is related to something that students might be more familiar with. So leveling, controlling the volume of each instrument. This is the fundamental job of mixing. If you do nothing else, this is your first job, your first responsibility, is just setting the volume of the mix, right? If the levels of the instruments are out of proportion, it's hard to appreciate a piece of music, right? It's very distracting. Basically, when mixing, we're subtly guiding the listener's focus, right? Let's say, oh, by bringing this level up, we're telling you focus on the vocals here. And now say, oh, here's a guitar feature, focus on the guitar here, right? We're sort of like, imagine at a concert how a listener can move their eyes around the stage and look at any single musician and sort of focus on what they're doing. With mixing, we're sort of guiding their experience, right? This is just an audio format we're thinking about here, where we're sort of guiding the listener's vision through audio. So for our analogy, I like to think of this as proportioning ingredients for a recipe. Just as you measure out the different amounts of ingredients to balance flavors, you can adjust the volume of tracks to balance a mix. Some ingredients are used in small quantities, hot peppers, while other might be used in larger quantities, rice pasta. Similarly, in elements of the mix, lead vocals might be featured prominently, while others, cowbell, might be used a little bit more sparingly, unless you're Will Ferrell. Panning. So once you have your sort of levels set, you're sort of saying, okay, here I roughly have my instruments in proportion, right? We're working with stereo music, right? We have two speakers, our left and our right. So if we have everything panned center, we've essentially created a mono mix. Now, mono is great. Much of the recorded history of music right up into the 60s was in mono. So those early engineers knew how to make a really balanced mix where everything, no matter if you had one speaker or 10, the same signal was coming out of those speakers, right? But now working in stereo, we can sort of say, well, when we look at an ensemble, they're not all standing right next to each other. They're spread out across the stage, right? Similarly, we could use pan to sort of say, okay, I want my lead vocals in the center and my kick drum in the center, but I want guitar 1 off to the side and guitar 2 off to the other side. And I want to have, some of my percussion instruments on one side, some of the percussion on the other side, backing vocals. I want them spread around so they're not interfering too much with the lead vocal. Right, so think about this like plating a meal, right? When a chef puts the food on the plate, they arrange it intentionally so certain components are in certain areas. Maybe a sauce is more off to the side, whereas the protein is right in the center. So this is really important. Think about, spacing your instruments out as sort of like creating that vision, like, right? You're presenting what you've created in the best possible light by putting it in its right spacing. EQ or equalization, right? So EQ, just to do some review, that is boosting or cutting certain frequencies in a sound, right? So maybe you recorded your guitar in a room with central air and there's some low hum. Maybe you want to like cut the low frequencies so you're getting rid of that low hum and you could just have the high frequencies of the guitar shine through. Or maybe for whatever reason you feel like the vocalist keeps getting buried in the mix and you want to just push the high frequencies of their voice up just a little bit to shine across all the other instruments in the mix. So EQ essentially is the cutting or boosting of certain frequencies using either software or on a mixer using the highs, lows, and mids to boost those sounds. So the analogy I have here is like spices, right? Cutting frequencies is like reducing overpowering taste to balance the overall flavor file. Just different dishes might need different seasoning, right? So boosting high frequencies is like zesty, bright flavors, right? Low frequencies are like rich, deep flavors like butter or cream or cumin or something like that, right? So having these different sort of effects kind of can help bring out the flavors that are already there in your sort of main part of your dish, but you're just sort of enhancing them. Then compression. Compression can be kind of a tricky topic, but I really like to think of it as doing if you got a solid mix, right? You get your levels good, but there's just that one part where the guitar goes a little too loud, and you don't want to just have to like pull the volume fader up and down all the time, right? Compression can kind of do that for you. It can kind of limit the range of volumes that an instrument is producing, so nothing is too low, so it's not heard, or too high that it's interfering. So it's sort of taming a signal. I think that's a good word for compression. It's taming those signals so they're a little bit less dynamic. The analogy I have here is like reducing a sauce, right? When you reduce a sauce, you're essentially controlling its intensity and consistency, much like how compression controls the dynamic range of audio. The threshold is the point at which you start to notice the sauce thickening. So if you've ever reduced the sauce, you say at a certain point, it's just the juice of whatever you cooked, right? It's very watery, and then compression sort of kicks in, just like that reduction kicks in once you're reducing that water content to really distill the flavor of that. So threshold is a point when it starts to thick. The ratio is like how much heat, right? Are you cooking this in a really high heat to really sort of tame it, or are you just kind of very slowly simmering, allowing that sauce to reduce very gradually? And finally, reverb, right? Now, when we eat at a restaurant, the environment matters a lot. Is it really loud and noisy and uncomfortable? Or is it you have beautiful natural light? There's some plants. There's the right kind of music playing for the type of restaurant it is, right? The ambiance, right? So we have ambiance and ambience, right? Reverb is ambience. You're creating a sense of space. The modern recording studio is a dry environment. It's the Latin term tabula rasa, right? It's a blank slate. That's the point of a modern recording studio, is not to color the sound too much, but just to say, hey, there's not too much echo. There's not really odd reflections or anything that's going to color the sound in a bad way. And then afterwards, we're going to add digital effects to create the sound, like, oh, this opera singer was singing in a hall, or hey, this guitarist was playing in a club with, a basement club or something like that. So we have different types of reverb that create different types of spaces and are appropriate for different styles of music, right? So we have things like hall reverb that's going to be very grand sounding, room reverb, cozy and intimate, plate reverb, modern minimalist, sort of very like 1980s kind of sound, a little bit metallic kind of sound. Again, right? We're just like there's different sort of you want a fine dining French restaurant to have a certain look, and you want a classical music recording to have a certain look, just like you could have a sort of informal family restaurant have a different look, right? So the ambiance, right, matters a lot, and you can do that through reverb, creating a sense of space in your music. So let's review and define the following terms, right? Level, pan, EQ filter, dynamic processing, which is a broad sort of term, but for today, we're talking mainly about compression, reverb, and automation. So in your next assignment, you're basically going to be going up to here, right? We're not going to be doing automation. Automation is really done in the sort of final stages of mixing, really to refine things to a way that a static mix couldn't do. So all of these things here are what's called a rough mix, and that's what you're going to be doing in your mixing assignment. So the balancing act of leveling. Achieve a balance between all elements of the mix, ensuring each element has its own space and is audible. Start with the faders to establish relative loudness levels, focusing on key elements of the song. So I always say start, if it's a vocal song, start with the vocals, leave those at unity, right? So unity is the zero gain, right? So here's your zero, that's your unity. Everything else should come down in proportion to the vocals. Really, the number one mistake young mixers or starting mixers make is pushing things up. And then you become like Mickey in The Sorcerer's Apprentice, and you just have to keep pushing everything up because everything is out of balance, right? That sort of master wizard knows that things go down instead of going up. We can always use a bus compressor. We can always use mastering to make things louder. Don't worry about loudness initially. Sort of have your loudest instrument and push everything else below it. So that's your sort of first step in leveling. Then we have panning, right? Now, if you go listen to Sgt. Pepper's or early 1960s music, I call this the Wild West era of panning, where engineers, there's no established like format for panning. So they said, I'm going to put the drums all the way over here, with the bass all the way over here. I'm going to put the lead guitar solo just in the left speaker. And it was really cool. And it went along with the style of the times. It was very psychedelic. But if you've ever tried to listen to those in a sub-ideal listening environment where you're far away from one speaker, or if one speaker is not working, you might miss an entire part of the song. Like a verse of lyrics might be missing, or a guitar part might be missing. So a lot of the sort of what's sort of established now is sort of a way of mixing music where you have monocompatibility. That's a really important term. Write that down. Monocompatibility is a stereo mix that can be listened to even if one speaker is not working, and you'll still get all of the sort of instruments. So basically, if you only have one of something, like a guitar solo, you don't want to pan it hard, or your vocal. You don't want to pan a vocal hard. You want to leave those in the center. Things like vocals, snare, kick, and bass, you want those right in the center. And then your percussion, piano, strings, pad, guitar, synth, and FX, those can be panned either left or right. If you have two background vocalists, one left and one right. If you have an electric guitar and acoustic guitar, one left, one right. That's your kind of idea, is that you're creating this. You have the center, you have the most important elements for typical rock or pop song, and then you have your sort of supporting elements sort of panned to the side, but not super hard. The exception might be if you have two guitars playing identical parts, what's called double tracking. Sometimes it sounds really nice to pan those hard left and right. So if you have two exact or almost exact copies, those can go hard left and right. Everything else should be panned sort of 25, 35% in the center. Cool. I have some text over on the side of the slide. Feel free to pause and take some notes on that if you need to. Continuing on, talking about equalization and filtering. So employ EQ to enhance total qualities and conflicting frequencies. Identify and address frequencies that clash between instruments and carving out distinct ranges. So we have here, this is what's called a parametric EQ. In programs like Logic or Pro Tools, you'll have that. If you're working in the free version of Soundtrap, you might not have a parametric EQ. You might have a graphic EQ, which works similarly, or even just a 3-knob EQ. You can do a lot with a 3-knob EQ with highs, mids, and lows. That's usually how most mixers work. If you're working on an analog mixer, say in a church or a venue, you just have those sort of 3 broad strokes. You can get a lot done with that. Parametric EQ is really good. So if you know exactly what frequency you're looking to reduce, or you want to find what frequency to reduce, they're really good in giving you a lot of options. But they give, with more options comes more challenge. So if you're starting out, don't be afraid to just say, hey, I'm just going to use the three different knobs in the EQ, low, mids, and highs, and try to get the sound that I want from there. Again, as with leveling, cut before you boost, right? So if you feel like it's, doesn't have enough highs, maybe just take away some of the lows, right? Boost the volume, right? Be very careful with boosting. And if you're adding 15 decibels of boost somewhere, it probably means that could have been recorded better, right? It's always better to fix it in pre, not in post. So be conservative with your EQ. Cut what needs to be cut, but don't boost too much. You'll create an unnatural sound, especially on things like acoustic instruments and voice. Subtle, a few decibels of boost can be really nice. 10, 15 decibels. Unless you're doing it for special effect, be very wary. Dynamic processing with a purpose, right? Use dynamic processing, compression, or limiting to control the dynamic range of instruments or vocals. In the example that you're going to do for this class, you're going to be using some dynamic processing on the guitar, because the electric guitar at some points just feels like it pokes out too much in the mix. So you're just saying, hey, guitar, you got to chill out a little bit. So, think of compression as your chill pill, sort of like, hey, you're all over the place. You're bouncing off the walls. I need you at like taking it down, right? So think about that student that's always doing that, right? Compression is that way you can find to get them to concentrate and to focus. Say, hey, you're doing great. I just need you at a 7 instead of a 10. Similarly, compression can be used if something's too quiet in the mix, right? You say it's always too quiet. By reducing and then boosting the gain at the end, you can take a quieter signal and make it more present throughout. Great strategy to do on bass, especially if the bass has been recorded a little quiet, or just to get it to sit right in that pocket. So this we don't have to do this as a discussion, but it's just a good thought exercise to think about compression if you're struggling to understand it. So imagine two people are listening to music in the car. One is listening to a playlist of contemporary pop hits, the other to early 20th century symphonic music. Who will be reaching for the volume knob more? Why? Right? So compression controls dynamics. If we think of this music like Mahler, Sibelius, it's very dynamic. Some sections, if you're listening in the car, might be totally buried by the sound of your engine, right? But some sections might be so loud that they'll scare you, right? So you have to turn it down. Versus when you listen to a pop song, it's really compressed. The vocals are compressed, the drums are compressed, the guitar is compressed, the keyboard is compressed. So everything kind of sits in a dynamic range that you don't have to reach that volume knob. There'll be dynamics in the song. There'll be quieter sections like a verse or an intro. There'll be louder sections, but it really has to do more with density. So it really comes down to compression. That's sort of, if you need to understand compression, it's limiting your dynamic range. Here's another great quote from Dave Durr, who's the president of Empirical Audio. They make some really great compressors, both hardware and software. He says, compression makes an audio signal sound louder without actually being louder. So it's different than your volume knob. When you're boosting decibels, you're making something louder. But when you're using compression, you're playing with psychoacoustics. So our brains perceive something to be louder if it's just generally louder over time versus really, really quiet and then suddenly loud, right? It's better to make things louder across a large period of time, because that's where perceptual loudness comes in. So that's what compressors do, is they get rid of those very loud and those very quiet sections, make things more sort of predictable, I guess, if you will, in terms of audio. And finally, reverb, right? In mixing, reverb serves as many purposes: depth, space, color, width, blend. There's a great book by Mike Senior. It's called Mixing Secrets for the Small Studio, where he has a great chapter of reverb, and he goes over each of those topics: depth, space, blend, and color. So definitely, if you're a little bit more advanced, I recommend that book if you've been recording for a little bit. And reverb can be either applied to all the instruments in a mix, right? The same reverb, or they can provide as an effect just for that one instrument. So a lot of times, say if you wanted, to make it sound like your band's playing in a room together, you could use the same reverb on all instruments. But if you wanted the vocals to have just a little extra shine, you could use a reverb just on that instrument. So it's really, really good way to set up. And you can dive into some videos on YouTube and that sort of thing if you're interested in that. And finally, automation. Again, we won't be doing this for this first project. This is that final step. We're saying, I've done all these things, but there's still that one point where I need to boost up the guitar. There's still that one point where I need to cut back the percussion. So it's that done after you develop that good static mix or that rough mix, right? And reference and restraint, right? So don't do this. If you look at this here, every track has 12 plugins. Do you need all 12 plugins, right? Think of what the early producers and engineers could do just with the mixing console, right? If it can be done with less steps, that's probably the better way to do it. That's my personal opinion. Also, it's good for your computer. I feel bad for this computer's CPU looking at all these different effects that are on all these different channels, right? Avoid over-processing. Just because some guy or girl on YouTube told you that it was good to use all these different effects in your effect chains doesn't make it right. Use your ears and listen to the music that you love, right? If you want your track to sound like X artist, listen to that artist and really make notes about what makes that track sound special. What are the relative levels of the mix? How is reverb used? How is panning used, right? To start to listen analytically is the best tool, right? It's not about plugins, it's about your ears. Collaboration and iteration, if you're working collaboratively, involve whoever you're working with early on. Don't wait to the end. Get their ideas, get their ideas for what reference tracks they like. And don't be afraid to experiment, right? I gave you some good general principles, but music is not about just following the rules. It's about experimenting. And there's many great examples from music history where accidents have resulted in some amazing discoveries. Early guitar amplifiers, distortion was basically just pushing the amplifier till it couldn't produce clean sound anymore. And people said, oh, that was great. There's other examples of the Rolling Stones, I believe, either the Rolling Stones or the Kinks, actually used a pencil and punctured the guitar speaker because they wanted a really kind of distorted sound, and a broken guitar speaker would give that sound. Not saying to break your gear, but what I'm saying is that you should be open to experimentation. And if things go wrong, see if you can find it. See you can use that somehow. Or if you put in something by mistake and you accidentally like it, you find you like it. Be open to that kind of stuff. Right, embrace the journey. The art of mixing is a journey of growth, right? Just like practicing an instrument, mixing is kind of like an instrument. The first time you do it, you can't expect to be a master of it, but by following the principles I've laid out, it should help you sort of get started, right? Start with the fundamentals. If you could just do one thing, get the levels right. If you could just do two things, play around with a stereo field, make it a stereo, not a mono recording. If you could just do three things, right? Put in some EQ. If you could just do 4 panning and 5 reverb. Think about those 5 as your 5 essential tools in that order. Add new tools and techniques gradually. Delays, choruses, modulation effects, tremolo, right? These are all things you can kind of add once you get the basics down. Also, listened to really great music that the sort of community of experts in the area has deemed to be really well mixed. Here's some links. If you download the PowerPoint, you can click on these to the, best engineered albums, non-classical, some sort of more recent ones, some older ones. There's also an entire Wikipedia page dedicated to this Grammy category. So you can go back to when it was first awarded and listen to all of these albums and sort of see, the trends and sort of see the sounds that people are going after and what people consider the aesthetics of a good mix. So this is a really good thing to check out. So that kind of wraps up our discussion on mixing. I'm really looking forward to hearing your mix assignments. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.